Star Trek, right? Star Trek? Hello?
You've been, all the speakers are off.
Cast today, if you've not been to a table read before, it's very similar to what they do when they're doing like TV shows. There's actors that sit around and read through the script.
Are we
That's
off?
exactly what we're doing. So this one is tailored to us. It's regarding the parable of the Good Samaritan. So our task is to revisit this famous parable that Jesus tells in Luke chapter 10. So you go back and read it. Specifically verses 25 through 37. And it's being told by the perspective of the original participants. But we're going to go around the table now and let everyone introduce themselves. We do have some table tents here, so you don't forget who's who. So we're going to start with Luke. Where's Luke? There's Luke.
Do that first, will you? My name is David, and I'll be reading the part of Luke, the author of the Gospel according to Luke in the book of Acts. In this role, I will offer behind-the-scenes comments, especially about the passages credited to Luke.
My name is Justin, and I'll be reading the part of John, a disciple of Jesus. Although John is also credited with writing the Gospel according to John, his presence in this reader's theater is not to comment on this Gospel, but simply to speak as one of Jesus' followers.
My name is Daniel, and I'll be reading the part of Thomas, one of the original 12 disciples. Most well known for doubting Jesus' resurrection, in this reader's theater, Thomas is simply one of the 12, although his healthy skepticism comes through occasionally.
We're going to have to watch out for Thomas. So I'm the narrator. My name's Lisa. I'll be reading the part, of course, of the narrator. In this role, I'll read much of the direct biblical material. I got the boring part, right? Okay. I'll also help us transition from scene to scene and maybe occasionally offer some extra insight on the text that we read.
My name is Chris, and I'll be reading the part of Susanna, female disciple of Jesus, identified here by the author's imagination as one of the 70 sent out by Jesus, although not specifically modeled on the Susanna mentioned in Luke 8, verses 13. This chapter's character's voice brought into this conversation by the author reminds us that there were women among the followers of Jesus.
My name is Jade, and I'll be reading the part of the Samaritan in the crowd. This is not the Samaritan in the parable told by Jesus. Rather, this is the character imagined by the author to allow us to hear a Samaritan perspective in the conversation.
My name is Dottie, and I'll be reading the part of the lawyer who questions sparks the parable at the center of this reader's theater.
So let's set the context of what we're going to be talking about today. Luke's gospel is generally dated about 80 to 85 AD. More often noted by scholars as 80 to 85 CE. I'm going to explain those. Meaning between the years 80 to 85 in the Common Era, so CE, Common Era. This is a designation that's used by scholars today instead of AD. AD came from Anno Domini. It means the year of our Lord in Latin. It's a Latin phrase. They use CE to recognize that although Jesus' birth has become the reference point for our common timeline, not all persons regard Jesus as Lord. More importantly for us, this means that Luke writes his gospel drawing on both oral traditions and written sources, some 50 years after Jesus' life and ministry. So it's unlikely that his chronology of events is exactly historical, but just as unlikely that it's entirely random too. Let's begin.
Of course, it's not random. I mean no disrespect to my evangelist counterparts, Matthew, Mark, and John, but scholars rightly note that my writing from vocabulary choice to literary style is the most polished in the New Testament. I'm writing what might today be called creative nonfiction, rather than just chronicling events. I'm trying to communicate them in a way that passes along the power of those events to those experiencing my book later on. That's what gospel is. a genre that tries to make the listener experience for themselves very good news. The story is related.
So it isn't by chance that this parable appears in chapter 10 while Jesus is, quote, on the way. After his opening chapters, which relate Jesus' birth, genealogy, and an episode from his childhood, Luke includes a series of things Jesus said and did in and around Galilee, the region where he grew up, about 70 miles north of Jerusalem. Then, in a very suggestive literary turning point, Luke writes, quote, as the time approached when he was to be taken from this world, Jesus firmly resolved to proceed towards Jerusalem.
If this were a film, the music would swell here in sort of ominous way for a moment to let you know this is a critical turn in events and one that will have dire consequences. Earlier in chapter 9, Peter makes his famous confession, "You are Christ," and Jesus begins to talk openly about the threat to his life. In much of the rest of that chapter, I show Jesus trying to make clear the cost of following him. And then he sets his face toward Jerusalem. Even without music in the background, it gives me goosebumps.
Luke then spends the next 10 chapters relating events that happened on the way to Jerusalem. Much of this material is unique to Luke. It's not found in other Gospels. And it's clear that for Luke, this section is intended to highlight the significance of Jesus' ministry and message. What happens in Jerusalem is a response to what happens on the way there.
That's true, but also remember what I just said about the character of gospel. This is literature that tries to draw you into it. That's how I see Christianity. You only understand it when you're in motion on the way. So as we move into these 13 verses, imagine your feet carrying the dust of the road, and imagine your heart wondering about what lies at the end, and experience this parable between that dust and that wonder.
I'll begin now, starting with verse 25. Quote, an expert on the law stood up to put Jesus to the test and said, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit everlasting life?"
Timing is everything, and the timing of this question matters. At the start of chapter 10, just as we were beginning to head to Jerusalem, Jesus appointed 72 of us, men and women, to go on ahead of him. We were instructed to go on in pairs and enter the village along the way, curing the sick, receiving hospitality, and proclaiming the nearness of God's reign. I was one of the 72. We had just returned. Luke writes that we returned with joy, saying, "Rabbi, even the demons obey us in your name." Then Jesus told us, "Blessed are the eyes that see what you see. For I tell you, many prophets and rulers wanted to see what you see, but never saw it, to hear what you hear, but never heard it." And then, like an unwelcome splash of cold water in our joy-filled faces, this lawyer steps forward to test Jesus.
And he wants to test Jesus. What's that about? Well, from Galilee onward, Jesus had been doing his own testing. He's been challenging the traditional ways of understanding Torah. Actually, he's been calling for a deeper understanding, one grounded in the prophets. There to be imago Dei, in the image of God, was to act in harmony with God's actions. And the prophets described that most clearly as radical compassion. But this lawyer wants to push back. Maybe he's heard rumors about how far Jesus is ready to go with compassion, and he wants to test the limits. Some people need things spelled out in no uncertain terms. I have to confess, I'm one of them. I kind of appreciated this guy stepping forward to ask a tough question. I wasn't about to do it myself, but I was eager for Jesus' response.
When it says, "I want to inherit everlasting life," you might think I'm asking about how to get to heaven, but my question wouldn't have so obviously meant that back in the first century, quote, "everlasting life" meant might mean the life that begins after we die. But in the Jewish faith of my day, there were no consensus about life after death. See, for much of our history, including right up to the 21st century, the Jewish people have not had a very clear notion of an afterlife. There are some people in my day starting to wonder about life after death, mostly because we Jews see so little evidence of God's justice ever taking hold here in this life. But it's not something we take for granted like you Christians do. It's not a central piece of our tradition, so give me the benefit of ambiguity here.
That's right. For Jews, the fullness of life has usually not meant going to heaven, but rather living in this world with integrity and passing on their traditions to the next generation. In fact, when I write my gospel, at least a decade after we've read his, I'll use the phrase everlasting life in a way that really means life that is immeasurably full, beginning already now. Personally, I suspect this is the sort of, quote, everlasting life the lawyer is testing Jesus about. In words that might be more clear to you, he's asking, in what ways should I live so that right here and now I know life in all its fullness?
Let's continue with the passage in Luke, reading verses 26 through 28. Jesus answered, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" The expert on the law replied, "You must love the Most High God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." Jesus said, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you'll live."
See, Jesus isn't saying if you do these things, you'll get a reward after you die. His heart and mind never worked like that. Everything from God is grace, freely given. But there is a logic to how life works. Some patterns of living leave you empty inside, or worse, and Jesus is saying that the Torah has been given to Jews as a gift with the wisdom to guide life toward fullness. And that love of God and love of neighbor sum up the wisdom of the Torah. And this is the type of living that leads to a life that is immeasurably full.
You make it sound so simple, but it isn't. Never has been. And it isn't any easier for you folks here today. Even the love of God part leaves lots to quarrel about. Ever tried changing the time of your worship service? Or the style of the music? Ever replaced the carpet, redone the sanctuary? How about moving from an immigrant language like German or Swedish or Norwegian to English? How about moving back to an immigrant language like Hmong or Somali or Spanish to welcome more people into worship? No, even the love of God is hardly clear-cut.
I agree, but the love of God wasn't my concern at the moment. I knew Jesus stood for better or for worse in the tradition of the Hebrew prophets. I knew that he placed infinitely high value on compassion, and I'd heard about the company he kept, from tax collectors to lepers, from women to many others who fell into the category of sinner. For transgressing any of the many Torah guidelines, I'd heard enough to wonder just what this Messiah meant by neighbor.
So let's continue reading in verse 29. But the expert on the law, seeking self-justification, pressed Jesus further. And just who is my neighbor?
We've just been living that question over the past few weeks. Sent out by Jesus in pairs, we've been told to leave our purses, our bags, our sandals behind. Our welfare rested entirely on the hospitality of those to whom we went. Would they welcome us as neighbors? And we were told to heal the sick and proclaim the reign of God to these people unknown to us, as if they were our neighbors.
Of course, you may remember there was an added note in their instructions. 2, Jesus told them that whenever they entered a town that did not welcome them as neighbor, that did not show hospitality to them, they were to simply move on, knocking the dust off their feet in protest against the lack of welcome to these unmarked messengers of God. But my point here was not to threaten judgment, but to call for compassion without discrimination. You welcome everyone, period. That's what I want my readers to hear. because the messengers of God almost always show up in your midst, vulnerable and without any clear identifying mark that says, I'm with God, be good to me.
I suppose I should speak up here. I've been trailing Jesus and this band of people for several days now. I'm a Samaritan, and to say there's no love lost between my people and the Jews would be an understatement. It's probably more accurate to say that neither side misses any opportunity to take a swing at the other. So it's not surprising that when the Jewish prophet passed through my village at the start of his journey to Jerusalem, we didn't exactly roll out the red carpet. It's a long, tired history of hard feelings. And one of the lightning rods is over where to worship God. Our tradition honors Mount Gersa as the holy place where the true altar to God belongs. But the Jews who outnumber us by far have long held that the temple in Jerusalem holds the true altar, and they despise us for being steadfast to our altar. So when Jewish pilgrims pass through our villages on the way to their temple, it stings.
I remember that. The shopkeepers dropped their shutters against us. The innkeepers closed their doors. Families pulled their children inside, and no one offered us food or drink or shelter.
It angered us, just like Samaritans, we thought. I was a bit of a firebrand in those days. My brother and I asked Jesus, can we kill them, Lord? Can we kill them all? But Jesus looked at us heartbroken as if to say, haven't you understood anything? But all he said was, no, you can't kill them all. And we regretted we ever asked.
That's why I'm here. I mean, I don't know exactly why I'm here, except this Jesus is a big prophet. Rumors about the Messiah are swirling around even in the Samaritan villages. And as they left our village that day, I was coming in from the field, and I overheard that exchange. I froze with fear at the possibility that this prophet, Messiah, might give the okay for his followers to call down fire on my people. My breath caught, and he said, no. He said, no, with a heaviness and a forcefulness that made it seem like both the sadness and the power in his voice were borrowed from God. And I have trailed this band of people since then, wondering at this might-be Messiah who seems, maybe, perhaps, at least not by condemning us, to have a place in his heart for Samaritans.
We continue with this passage, reading verses 30 through 32. Jesus replied, there was a traveler going down from Jerusalem to Jericho who fell prey to robbers. The traveler was beaten, stripped naked, and left half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road. The priest saw the traveler lying beside the road, but passed by on the other side. Likewise, there was a Levite who came the same way. This one too saw the afflicted traveler and passed by on the other side.
My ears perked up immediately, having just returned from traveling on the road. I knew all too well the perils that could await you between cities. These were hard times. There's no excuse for banditry, but it's no secret that between the taxes levied by Rome and the tithes required by the temple, many of my Jewish brothers had seen their farms foreclosed on. They watched helplessly as their family's heritage was forfeited, and especially in rural areas between cities. A landless Jew is just barely a Jew. So robbers were a common enough threat. And while it is true that one by one they each chose to become robbers, I suspect that very few of them made that choice happily.
Half dead, that's exactly what the Greek word says, as close to death as to life, teetering between the two. And that's a problem for these two fellows. Priests and Levites serve in the temple. More than just a job, it's their life. Priests offer sacrifices. They stand as the doorway between this world and the holy world of God. Levites serve in the temple in other ways. Think of them like the altar guide, guild, the organist and choir director, the custodian and the cantor, all rolled into one. Whatever needs doing each day, keep the temple running. Levites see it gets done.
And if the temple is the height of holiness, short of God, of course, if it's a place saturated, dripping with holiness, well, death is the height of impurity. It's the place, the moment, where life runs amok. And those who serve in temple have special obligations to avoid proximity to death. It may strike you as primitive or superstitious. Some of you might even be superstitious yourselves. But to these people, it was real. If you come into contact with a dead person, or even with a person lingering at death's doorstep, you become ritually unclean, unfit to do your job, unfit to be who you are called to be. You can get ritually pure again, but the book of Leviticus is pretty clear. If you serve in the temple, you simply don't go near a dead body, or you defile yourself. And the only people you even consider defiling yourself for are your next of kin. Nobody else. Both the priest and the Levite are in a real bind.
Well, they're in a tough spot, but not really a bind. The law is very clear. It's unfortunate, even tragic, for the wounded traveler, but they respond exactly as the law says. They move to the other side and pass by in order to preserve their ability to serve God in the temple.
But that is the bind, after all, because Jesus has exposed a bind within the religious traditions itself. In order to preserve their purity to serve God, they must choose to not offer compassion to the man near death. How can that be an expression of loving their neighbor? And how can it be that serving God in a building can outweigh the importance of serving God in the body of a person in need?
But this isn't just about a bind within Judaism. I'm convinced Jesus told his parable because he saw that even his own followers might be tempted to make obedience to rules and rituals more important than people. Listen, both a Lutheran and a Catholic chaplain gave their blessings to the men who dropped the atomic bomb on Nagasaki. One of the landmarks given to the pilots that day was St. Mary's Cathedral, the center of Christianity in Japan. And this building was the visual sighting used to drop the bomb. As one writer put it, and what the Japanese imperial government could not do in over 200 years of persecution, American Christians did in 9 seconds. The entire worshiping community in Nagasaki was wiped out. Didn't these two chaplains also determine to fulfill their duty, choose to pass by the other side, avoiding the civilians in Nagasaki who were half dead the moment the plane started heading their way?
You're right. This is about the impulse in all of us, individually and in groups, to place our allegiances to the things we value above our allegiances to God's children. When you purchase toys or clothing, do you really want to think about the people in sweatshops who made them? When you buy your food, do you really want to consider the working conditions of those who harvested and processed it?
And that's my question. Who counts as a child of God? Who is my neighbor? To whom do I owe this allegiance? I mean, you have to draw a line someplace, don't you?
So the parable continues in verses 33 through 35. Let's read those. But a Samaritan who was taking the same road also came upon the traveler, and filled with compassion, approached the traveler and dressed the wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then the Samaritan put the wounded person on a donkey, went straight to an inn, and there took care of the injured one. The next day the Samaritan took out 2 pieces of silver and gave them to the innkeeper with the request, look after this person, and if there's any further expense, I'll repay you on the way back.
I couldn't believe my ears. In this moment, my world was turned upside down. You have to understand, no Jew spoke well of a Samaritan. We claimed to share the same faith as the Jews, but no one accepted us. And here, in this prophet's tale, in this Messiah's message, Suddenly, a Samaritan was taking center stage.
I couldn't believe my ears. My world was turned upside down. If I could have retracted my question at this point, I would have reeled it back in and walked away. This is not the way I expected this to go. I'm angry, flustered, disoriented. Who does this guy think he is?
Samaritans. This is a family feud that goes way back. And if you don't realize all the historical, theological, emotional, ethnic baggage tied up in this, you'll come away thinking we're all just supposed to go out and be good Samaritans. But for Jesus' audience, that was unimaginable.
750 years earlier, the Assyrian Empire swept through this region. They conquered the northern 10 tribes of Israel and scattered them to the four winds. That's how they treated everyone. They uprooted the vanquished and dispersed them until they simply disappeared. Then they brought in peoples who had been conquered elsewhere and placed them in what had been the land of Israel. These people were settled in the hill country known as Samaria. But some of the people living in this area claimed to still be Israelites. They said they were members of the two tribes of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh. They claimed to be part of a handful of Israelites who had never been scattered and who viewed themselves as faithful to the traditions of Moses.
Then, 135 years after that, the Babylonian Empire conquered the Assyrians, swallowing up the remaining two tribes of Israel, known now as the Kingdom of Judah. They were carried off into exile. But twice in the book of 2 Kings, we hear that as the Babylonian army moved through, they left behind the poorest people of the land, the least of the Israelites. And for the next 50 years, while the remnant of Israel, known as Judah, lived in exile in Babylon, these poorest of the poor who'd been left behind lived up in the hill country of Samaria.
Finally, a third superpower emerges in the region, Persia. The Persian Empire conquers Babylon, claiming all of their lands and all their captive people, just as the Babylonians had earlier done to Assyria. The Persian king Cyrus decides to release exiles and allow them to go home and rebuild their cities and their temples. So the Israelite captives return to Jerusalem, wearied by a generation in exile, but overjoyed to be back home. When they set out to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, certain people came down from the hill country, the land known as Samaria. They say that they too are Israelites, and they are eager to help rebuild.
Were they from among the poorest people of the land, left behind by the Babylonians, or from the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, living in the hill country since the Assyrians' conquest, or from the displaced people brought in by the Assyrians, who perhaps intermarried with Israelites left behind? We don't know. We do know that they came down from Samaria, and that they regarded themselves as children of Israel, and that the Israelite refugees returning from Babylon rejected them and refused to acknowledge their kinship, either biologically or spiritually. So for at least 500 years before this parable was told, Samaritans have claimed to be Jews, and Jews have rejected those claims. By the time Jesus' tale takes this most unexpected turn, Samaritans were the most despised ethnic group among Jews, so they were considered worse than any of the Gentiles because they claimed a kinship that Jews regarded as false.
I'm not a historian, a theologian, or a biologist. I only know that from my birth, I was raised to honor the tradition of Moses. From my childhood, I learned that in my own land, I was regarded as an unclean traitor. But I can tell you this, by the time of Jesus, my people had never wavered in more than 500 years in their claim to be true children of Israel. And for 2,000 years since Jesus, my people have continued this claim, never wavering. We have all but disappeared. As of 2007, only 712 Samaritans remained in the world. And yet, in your 21st century, scientists using genetic testing confirmed 2,500 years of being ostracized, that my people indeed shared a common ancestor with the Jews dating back to the time of the Assyrian conquest. But at the time of this parable, all that mattered was that my heritage, ever before despised among the Jews, suddenly moved from the margin to the center of the story, from outcast to honored.
The passage concludes in verses 36 and 37. Let's read those. Then Jesus asked the expert on the law, which of these three, in your opinion, was the neighbor to the traveler who fell in with the robbers? The answer came, the one who showed compassion. Jesus replied, then go and do the same.
I was trapped. It had been my question and then his answer. But now it was his question and I didn't want to answer. I had set out to test him and suddenly found that I was the one being tested. My anger was gone, edged out by wander too deep for words. It would be days, weeks, months before I could repeat the parable to others. Even in that moment, I simply could not make the S word come out of my mouth. I could not say who had acted as neighbor. So without actually naming him, I just mumbled the one who showed compassion.
I was stunned too. I don't think any of us had expected this. I like things to be clear. I like things to be concrete, touchable. But this was a little too much even for me. Samaritans as neighbors? If that was true, who could possibly be left to not be our neighbor? Is he really saying that there are only neighbors in the world?
That's exactly it. Now, it will be a while before Jesus' followers figure that out. By the way, have you figured it out? But at least now the secret's out in the form of this Samaritan showing mercy to a Jew. You might remember that. Unlike Matthew's gospel, my genealogy of Jesus doesn't stop at Abraham. It goes all the way back to Adam. Jesus is here for all mankind, for every son of Adam and every daughter of Eve, for all the Gentiles, and even for the Samaritans. Yes.
But there's this too. Jesus told parables to describe the reign of God. He often began with the phrase, the reign of God is like, and then he'd go on to give us a word picture of what it looked like when God was reigning as monarch. He tells his parable to answer a question about neighbors, but is it possible that he also meant for us to consider imagining God like a Samaritan? Could he ask us to do that? Is it possible that God can be found in compassion coming from the least expected, even from the most despised persons in our lives?
I never expected that this Jewish Messiah would give my people an honored place in his tradition. I never thought he would open up the possibility that his tradition could also be our tradition, made common to us by deeds of compassion. Have you ever known this much surprise? Can you imagine what it was like to be a Samaritan that day? Or what it would be like to be a Samaritan today? Can you?
In your mind, did you go through the song, It's a Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood?
I was thinking it.
Imagine at that time, imagine today if we treated everybody like our neighbors. I don't care if it's your real next door neighbor, the next town, the next state, the next country. What a difference that would have made. That would have made. Give them a round of applause. Thank you all for volunteering. We hope you got something out of this, and hopefully you guys will be able to continue some of these along the way. We have a whole book full of, I think there's about 12 different stories here that we can go through again. So appreciate. No, go ahead. Sure, you want to say absolutely.
Two things came to me when listening to you. Thank you so much for reading so well and sharing the story with us. But the first thing that caught my attention and I got off track was when
We're shocked.
And so after a year, it took a year to break that on the whole campus. A white student not sitting with black students and not talking to black students, but even the dormitory were segregated. They would not put a black student in a room with a white student. So we were breaking those barriers like this American. And let me say that living that kind of life can make you feel like you're on the desert, you're on a spiritual desert, that your soul gets dried out. I'll put it like that. That's how I feel like the soul is dried because of those conditions. And that we had to fight to remove those conditions and to be fully accepted on the campus. I can understand some very perspective. Am I okay? Am I going to be okay? Am I safe in this society? One time I had a breakdown in college. I was a resident assistant. I worked in the dorm. This is 2 years in my junior year. And I thought that I was going to be killed on campus. At that time, I was worried about getting killed. My mother wouldn't know what the body was. And that went on for 2 weeks. And that's how deep segregation can be, and especially when you're not near any of your folks that it feels safe. So after 2 weeks, I came out of it, and I was okay, but it can really take a toll on you. So,
Yeah, just imagine the fear that, you had.
yeah.
Just like the Samaritan woman, fearful because she was hearing the conversation in the parable about what they were wanting to do, which was go in and kill them all.
Exactly.
I mean, it's
I was thinking all
very good,
and my mother won't know what her body is. And that's the first thing.
yeah.
Thank you so much for this reading, and it really gives me a lot to think about.
Thank you. Thank y'all. Thank y'all for being here. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.